The bell tolls at midnight. Greetings. I'd like to welcome all of my midnight marauders. Come on in, get comfy, and lend me your imagination. Sometimes one can unknowingly wear out their welcome, especially those who don't believe in anyone else's boundaries but their own. I call this midnight tale, You Better Not Be Here When Tom Comes. It was a blistering July evening in the streets of downtown Cincinnati, Ohio, and the atmosphere was bustling. Dozens of cars were backed up for miles on the highway full of people trying to get home from work on a hectic Friday night, and folks could hear the silky, soulful notes of Grady's Lounge, where the sound of bountiful groove-coated saxophones serenaded the entire neighborhood. Grady's Lounge and Nightclub was an attractive, hip little blues joint where you could come, relax, and grab a bite to eat, and a much-needed stiff drink after a long and turbulent work week while listening to the carefree, soulful vocals of Odessa Blades ripple out velvety smooth notes that would give you goosebumps on the back of your neck. The lounge attracted a more mature atmosphere, a more seasoned crowd, if you will. And concerning the dress code, there was never a shortage of tilted brims, three-piece suits for the gents and pearls, and kitten heels for the ladies, especially when dancing till the morning hours was often the norm. There was hardly ever a bad vibe in Grady's, except for Nate Banks, a belligerent old sloppy drunk who knew no boundaries, often showing up right when the party was really starting to jump, sneaking past security without paying and invading unsuspecting guest personal space, coughing near their plate so they'd get grossed out and offer him their meal, feeling he's contaminated their food. Mabel Porter, a small in stature but larger-than-life personality, was a woman with no tolerance for BS. She frequented the lounge, and tonight, more than any other night, was fed up and seemingly extremely pissed off with Nate's disrespectful behavior. She went to notify security, Big Mike, who she found in the kitchen sitting at a small table, having a bite to eat in the corner, where the cooks normally take their breaks. She walked up to him and yelled, "Big Mike, that damn fool Nate is at it again." "What you mean again, Mabel? His delusional ass ain't never stopped being an unstable moron," Mike retorted. Mike looked furious as he sucked his teeth and slammed his half-eaten burger on the plate and stood up with an aggravated jolt as his massive 6'7", 350-pound frame took off towards the lounge floor with malice in his eyes. Big Mike, hungry and frustrated, exclaimed, "He must have snuck through the door at the back alleyway again the moment I went on break. Just wait till I see this ignorant old fool." Big Mike rushed to the lounge floor, his eyes squinted, scooping hard to spot this pest amongst the guests. He noticed there was a steady crowd of happy lounge-goers dancing and enjoying themselves, yet that old irritant was nowhere to be found. "Good riddance," Big Mike said with a sigh of relief, hoping never to see this little annoying freeloading weasel again. The night progressed, and an inebriated Nate with no residence found himself shivering sitting on a bus stop waiting for two old acquaintances, Anna and Rick, to share a bottle of Ripple with as he sat bundled up to his ears as the night air swirled and howled around his face and neck, trying to penetrate his three-layered clothing and scarves securely wrapped around his head. The bus came speeding down the street, going much faster than usual, and zoomed past the bus stop where Nate sat shivering and waiting for Anna and Rick to get off as usual. But oddly, they were a no-show. Nate threw up his middle finger and cursed the driver as he stared at the back of the bus, now halfway down the street. Nate began walking slowly, fighting against the wind as it blew his clothing wildly. He was headed in the direction of Manor Hill Drive, where the lights seemed to fade in the distance, the closer you get to the old, supposedly haunted squat house that bore a notorious reputation of a cannibalistic demon that showed up after 3 a.m. No one had ever stayed in that particular dwelling past the witching hour. Nate, now off of the main road and walking up to what looked like a dark and grim, dilapidated castle on a hill, began to feel spooked. He stood in the middle of the gravel road, indecisive about taking another step towards this old abandoned and run-down house, now resembling digs right out of a Dracula movie. Suddenly, he heard a male voice say, "Nate, what the hell are you doing just standing in the dark, man?" Nate was startled to see Rollo and Roberta Mackey walking towards a big blue van parked on the side of the road. Nate, cold and shivering, breathed a sigh of relief and replied, "Just looking for somewhere warm to chill for the night, man." Roberta looked at Nate and asked, "You weren't actually thinking about spending the night in the old manor house, were you, Nate? You know, Anastasia and Ricardo were two of the last people that stayed in that house overnight, and they're still missing. Officer Carter told a mutual friend of ours, Estelle, that there were puddles of blood near the fireplace, but no bodies." A concerned look came over Nate's face as he said, "Damn! I was just at Guardian Mission last Thursday night with Anna and Rick chillin'. I thought it was very strange that I hadn't seen them since." Rollo reached in his pocket and handed Nate a few dollars to rent a room for the night. "Here, man, go get a room at Super 7 Motel. I know the rooms aren't spit, but it's a hell of a lot better than freezing your ass off out here in the cold all night, or even worse, staying in the old manor house." Roberta then walked over and hugged Nate, saying, "Just let it go, Nate. They'll get what's coming to them for how they treated you." Nate nodded, then looked up at the old house and noticed what looked like a big black shadow in the window looking down at them. Nate, startled and taken aback by what he thought he'd just seen in the window, began rubbing his eyes and blinking as a concerned Rollo and Roberta looked on. Nate stretched out his hand, shaking from the ripple and the freezing night air, took the money from Rollo's hand, looked at him and Roberta and said, "Thanks, Rollo, man. I really appreciate you guys." He then proceeded towards the direction of the Super 7 Motel for the night. Nate walked away feeling a sense of contentment about his security for the night, but as he entered the Super 7 Motel, the night auditor loudly and sternly said, "Sorry, pal, we're full for the night." A sense of dread and disappointment enveloped over Nate's face as he realized his only two options were to either freeze to death in this 0-degree night air or travel back up the dark and desolate road towards the sinister Manor Hill house. Nate decided to ditch the foreboding notion of having to deal with the presumably cannibalistic demon lying in wait to devour him at the witching hour just when a restful sleep was starting to kick in, or having to deal with a possible whole ass kicking by Big Mike at Grady's Lounge and Bar. As Nate stumbled back down the hill, there wasn't a soul on the street. He decided to head back to Grady's Lounge and was startled by a loud catfight in the alleyway. Nate was unsettled by the low hums of the animals' anticipated brawl like a vicious warning from one to the other. At the peak of the soon-to-be squabble, Nate deliberately kicked a can, and both cats took off running in different directions into the relentless chill of night. Nate laughed in a low, muffled tone as he slid a thin, flat metal object from his duffel bag and swiped it between the back door and the lock itself. Hearing a click as the lock opened, Nate postured with a sigh of relief, saying, "Jackpot." Nate, steeped in trepidation, looked left to right down the alleyway before peeling off his jacket and 3 more layers of clothing just to be able to squeeze through this tiny entranceway that sat just a few feet from the kitchen door. Nate crawled inside of the lounge, shaking like a leaf, blowing what looked like clouds of breath vapor from the cold night air, and pulled his worn goods through the small space behind him, noticing that his duffel bag was on the verge of the safety pin popping loose and the strap breaking. Nate lay there on the floor for a few seconds to make sure he hadn't triggered an alarm, then moved slowly across the floor, keeping his head down, then slowly raising his head to peek out of the window to make sure no security was surveillancing the premises. He also listened in hard inside of the lounge, making sure there was no one moving about. He stood up ever so carefully while shivering and wiping his runny nose, then began briskly piling back on his grungy attire. Nate walked silently with uncertainty towards the direction of the kitchen, not knowing what lay behind the kitchen door. Nate carefully pushed the door open and realized that there was no one there. He walked over to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. There, stacked on every shelf, was a plethora of mouth-watering delectables. Nate stood there for a second, with his eyes stretched wide, then proceeded to peel back the box of desserts that contained dozens of sweet and creamy chocolate eclairs. He grabbed the whole container and began devouring them one by one. Nate spent the next 15 minutes sampling and cramming down anything he thought looked appealing, savoring every bite with a voracious appetite. For the first time in months, Nate finally felt what it must be like to be completely satiated and not yearn for food. He found himself looking around the club, admiring things he had taken for granted before, like the gold-colored grand piano and the artwork that adorned the place. On the walls were portraits of blues greats like Billie Holiday, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Thelonious Monk, Muddy Waters, Dizzy Gillespie, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, Charlie Parker, Herbie Hancock, and Nina Simone. Nate shook his head, thinking how in the world could Odessa Lanzi ever think she could possibly fill shoes that big? Nate chuckled under his breath as he walked through the lounge quietly and proceeding with caution. Suddenly he heard a loud blaring siren outside and snapped back into focus as he gathered himself, hurried to the restroom, and silently pushed the door closed behind him. Nate looked around the gentleman's room, grateful and taking full advantage of an unoccupied facility. He groomed himself with the bar of soap, paper towels, and hot water. After he helped himself to a fresh food server's uniform he'd found hanging in a closet near the restroom. It was a size too big, but given the rags that Nate was previously dressed in, it was just perfect for him. Nate began reminiscing, feeling that he hadn't felt this sense of equanimity since he and Odessa, his ex-girlfriend and now Grady's new fiancé and #1 evening vocalist, lived together on 5th Street 3 years ago. Nate began to take a long, hard look at himself in the mirror, feeling like a naive idiot. An overwhelming sense of credulousness and betrayal bombarded his thoughts, and remnants of a backstabbing harlot began flooding his mind. He stood there cursing himself for ever bringing Odessa to Grady's lounge in the first place. His mind raced back to that July night when he brought Odessa to Grady's lounge one date night to show her a good time and meet a few people. The evening was warm and humid, and there was a new and exciting performer scheduled on the ticket each week as the lounge's popularity grew. This pulled in enormous crowds, which meant lots of money and recognition for the lounge. Nate and the likes of Odessa Lanzi, his high school sweetheart, walked in the door, and Nate introduced her to that hawkish, scheming, snake-like Grady Benjamin, and the rest was history. Needless to say, things didn't work out between Nate and Odessa after that night, as Grady had other plans for her, yet a delusional Nate still carried hope for a reconciliation between himself and Odessa, despite the fact that everyone but himself could see his aspirations lay bare, a complete and senseless waste of time and effort. Nate began to feel the anger rush to the top of his forehead as he thought about all the ways he tried to get under Grady's skin by showing up and disrupting guests, making a complete ass of himself on any given night, but usually when the lounge was full to capacity. It was all to no avail, as Big Mike would just manhandle Nate by tossing him out of the lounge in such a way that made certain his ass would meet the concrete. Nate steamed and frantically began searching the kitchen for booze to numb the fury of defeat and the pain of a broken heart. He walked into the pantry that had an almost obscure sliding door, which had to have been recently built. He slid back the door ever so quietly, and there were bottles upon bottles of aged whiskey. He rubbed his hands together as he chuckled happily, while whispering to himself, "Looks like I've died and gone to whiskey heaven." Nate pulled his old duffel bag close to him while he lined the inside with the old clothes sticking up out of the top of this worn and faded bag, and started picking from the finest bottles of bourbon he could fit inside of it. While putting the fifth bottle in the bag, Nate heard voices in the back alleyway near the kitchen door, which caused him to pause as he quietly squatted down in the corner of this hidden liquor room and remained silent and, above all, motionless. He listened closely, realizing the voices sounded like Grady and Odessa. Suddenly, he heard keys opening the door from the back alley entrance, then the loud click-clack of women's heels walking sharply across the floor. Unmistakably, the woman's voice was in fact none other than Odessa's, followed by Grady asserting some sort of hostile tenor as they were having a heated verbal altercation. Odessa angrily barked at Grady. "Listen, Grady, you old fool. My voice is what's pulling in the crowds now, not these watered-down drinks you serve the customers all while you sell the most expensive bottles to your shady business partners, and I get paid peanuts." "Look, Odessa, never mind about my business dealings," Grady retorted in a loud hiss. Odessa then cut Grady off, saying, "Next time you get a call, count me in or else." "Or else what?" said Grady. "Or else I'm moving on," barked Odessa. Odessa's loud heels could be heard marching towards the door as an apologetic Grady ran behind her with a softer tone to his voice, pleading, "Odessa, please." Nate could hear a car door slam and followed by an engine revving loudly as a bright red BMW tore out of the driveway into the night. Suddenly, the wheels started turning in Nate's head, and he came up with an idea, a wonderfully terrible idea. The time was 4:45 a.m. Nate, still inside Grady's, pulled off his bulky jacket and squeezed back through the small door with food and liquor in tow as daybreak loomed across the freezing city. Nate left the lounge and headed to buy a pack of cigarettes at Lucky Fuel, a local gas station. Suddenly, he heard Larry and Rob, two homeless guys who lived in the neighborhood, conversing about the infamous Manor Hill house. "Hey, Rob, have you noticed Luke hasn't been seen since last Saturday, and the last place he stayed was the old Manor Hill house?" "No one has seen him since," said a concerned Larry. "Hey, what's up, guys?" Nate quickly interjected. "I couldn't help but overhear you guys talking about the disappearances taking place at the old Manor Hill house. Matter of fact, 2 friends of mine have also gone missing." Rob and Larry looked at Nate, then at each other with concerned expressions. "Hey, fellas, how about this? I have a few bottles of the finest whiskey in all of Cincinnati. I'm going to the old manor tonight. "Drinks are on me," Nate offered with a smile. A look of uncertainty came across Larry's face, but Rob, whose eyes lit up with anticipation, quickly accepted the offer, saying, "Hell yeah, man, we're there." Nate was undeniably shaken at the fact that some of the homeless and a few of his longtime acquaintances had all gone missing after staying the night at the old manor house. An even more disturbing thought was Nate's conspiracy theory that the city he'd grown up in could be behind the disappearances of homeless individuals and using some made-up cannibalistic demon as some sort of scapegoat. Many thoughts raced through Nate's head about how to get even with Grady and Odessa for their heartless betrayal, so he decided to set them up by calling Grady and organizing a meeting at the old manor house. He'd pretend to be a big spending buyer looking to illegally purchase Grady's finer bourbon, well below the market value of the watered-down version that Grady was overcharging his customers for. It would be too good of a deal for the money-hungry Grady to turn down. Nate would record the entire meeting and use it for evidence of Grady's illegal dealings. That would be sure to get Grady's shut down once the authorities got wind of it. This awesome plan of Nate's wouldn't take place until Friday, which was 4 days away. Nate realized that he'd have time to check out the old Manor Hill house. The more Nate stewed on his plot, the more he better conceived it. He'd have Rob, an unfamiliar voice, call Grady to set up the meeting. He would then prepare for his terribly awesome plan for revenge on Grady and Odessa to take place on Saturday night. Nate was in Operation Payback mode. He'd also wanted to keep his promise to Larry and Rob, so he decided to bravely go through with his meeting with them at the old Manor Hill house. He figured they'd toss back a few shots of this high-end bourbon and get the 411 about the nefarious goings-on in this dilapidated house of horrors. He began heading towards Manor Hill, holding his duffel bag filled with the expensive bottles of liquor as the wind howled and the freezing cold night air felt like a blade slicing across Nate's frozen face. He made it up the gravel road as the lights from the main street became just a small glimmer in the distance. Nate looked terrified as he began to walk up the splintered stairs leading to the front door of this dark and unsettling dwelling. The creaking of each stair seemed to be telling Nate not to take another step. However, there stood Nate at the front door with a lump in his throat and a sick feeling in his stomach. Nate hesitantly stretched out his hand and began turning the rusted doorknob while slowly pushing the door open. It gave a loud and sinister creaking noise from century-old rusted hinges. Nate's eyes stretched to capacity while his heart was beating through his chest. The temperature inside this dark, mildew-smelling house was much colder than outside, and it sent a chill down Nate's spine. Nate slowly inched inside the old manor house, his focus now on the large black stains on the floor next to the fireplace in which the mantel precariously hung sideways over the structure. Nate slowly began to walk towards the heart of this forsaken dwelling and got a gust of a foul odor resembling a dead animal carcass. He continued on, now aiming his small flashlight above his head in the direction of the staircase where he could clearly see that most of the railing was missing. Nate was uncomfortable and scared out of his mind, but crazed with curiosity as to what was up those stairs. Nate approached the staircase and cautiously walked up them as quietly as possible. But quiet wasn't possible, as each step he took gave a lingering creak, almost as if the stairs were sending a warning for Nate to retreat. Nonetheless, he continued up the stairs until he reached the top floor and noticed a long, dark hallway with 3 rooms the length of the hallway on either side, Nate shined his flashlight down the long hallway, trying to make sense as to what the rumors were all about, when suddenly he saw what looked like a big black shadow lean its upper torso out of one of the last rooms at the end of the hall. Startled, Nate quickly spun around and leaped halfway down the stairs, losing his footing and rolling down the rest of the way to the bottom of the staircase. Suddenly, he heard a loud and worried male voice say, "Damn, Nate! Man, what's going on?" Nate looked up to see Larry and Rob curiously standing there near the doorway with backpacks flung over their shoulders and a few edible perishables for an indulgent evening. Rob curiously re-asked the question as Nate struggled to his feet and looked back up the stairs, shining his flashlight, saying, "Oh, ain't nothing going on, man, just a little clumsy, I guess." Nate tried to laugh off the ordeal. Larry walked over to this old rickety fireplace, unzipped his backpack, and took out 4 logs of wood to burn. Nate and Rob pulled up a few folding chairs that were in the corner as they swiped away the cobwebs on them and began to cozy up near the freshly lit fireplace while rubbing their hands together, trying to get warmth from the flames. Nate opened his duffel bag, pulled out a large bottle of the good stuff, poured the guys a heaping glass of bourbon, and turned on a small battery-operated radio to his favorite blues station to break the monotony. As the guys began to relax, Nate began to question them about the infamous Manor Hill house where they were now all assembled. Nate turned towards Larry and asked, "What's the deal with this place, man?" Larry's eyes slowly looked around the room and began to tell the story of a man named Tom Berenger. Tom was a God-fearing, law-abiding man who purchased this particular piece of land in the early 1900s for his wife and kids. He worked diligently and built the house by himself. It took him 10 years. Folks said that while working out in the yard one hot summer evening, Tom was bitten by some sort of vermin, an ugly horned creature the likes of which nobody had ever seen before. Story had it that he refused to go to the doctor because of his distrust for medical experts, and over the course of a few weeks, he began to slip into utter madness that ultimately led to his wife and kids going missing, never to be seen or heard from again. However, rumor had it that one warm July night when there happened to be a blood-red full moon at 3 a.m., the witching hour, Tom, frustrated and violently ill, prayed for healing from the Almighty. But it was to no avail. He became crazed and out of his mind with anger, flipped his faith, and began calling on the Dark One to keep him from dying. And he offered that in return, he'd sell his everlasting soul. Supposedly, ever since that night, the old Manor Hill house had been abandoned. Folks say that the sly and cunning of Jackal, the devil himself, transformed Tom into some sort of bloodthirsty cannibalistic demon that feeds on the bodies of the living if they're brave enough to stay in his house upon the witching hour. The exact same time Tom supposedly sold his soul to the devil. This was the only way that Tom could stay alive. Nate sat there with his mouth hanging open and terror in his eyes as he looked down at his watch and back up the stairs where he'd seen the dark shadow. "Hey man, we're gonna take off at 11:30 p.m. I suggest you do the same, Nate," Rob suggested. Nate, trying to act unbothered by the story, responded, "Yeah, we'll see, man. It's just starting to get warm in this piece, you know?" 11:15 p.m. rolled around, and both Rob and Larry began packing up their belongings while stumbling to the door and inviting an inebriated Nate to come with them. Nate, being stubborn, said, "I'm gonna stay for a spell, but I need you to do something for me, Rob." Nate told Rob about his plan to set up a meeting to buy the expensive bottles of liquor from Grady, in which Rob promptly and happily agreed to, especially when he saw the bottle of bourbon that Nate promised him in return. Nate had Rob call Grady, who immediately answered the phone. However, hearing a voice he was unfamiliar with, and even more suspicious with how this man got his number, made Grady apprehensive. But Grady invited Rob's conversation. Rob inquired about buying the bourbon. Grady became hesitant to discuss the matter with Rob until Rob began making up a story about a mutual connection in which the third party wished to remain anonymous. Rob continued by offering to buy the pricey bottles of bourbon, proposing a meeting at 3 a.m., and of all places at the Manor Hill house. But what Rob didn't know was as soon as Grady heard that Rob was purchasing the liquor at full price, Grady was sold on the business deal and readily agreed to meet Rob at the proposed time and location, stating that he'd be there with bells on. Rob hung up the phone, having successfully set up the meeting with Grady. Rob high-fived a drunk and slurring Nate, who was overjoyed at the notion that he'd finally get his lick back after he was humiliated and betrayed by Grady and Odessa. However, Grady decided to keep this little business meeting a secret and not disclose this information to Odessa. Rob and Larry took off stumbling down the dirt road away from the old Manor Hill house. Nate sat near the fire and drifted in and out of sleep while the brightly lit warm fire crackled in the background. Swaying back and forth in his chair, Nate began to feel the cold air penetrate his hoodie and swirl around his face. Fear jolted him awake, and he immediately opened his eyes and noticed the fire had burned down and was almost completely out. He looked down at his watch, and the time read 2:49 a.m. Nate scuffled to his feet and grabbed this duffel bag, pulling his hoodie string closer around his frozen face, and headed to the door. He stood there with the front door wide open, shivering with frightened anticipation, waiting to see what appeared at this so-called witching hour. Suddenly, Nate heard a low growl emanating from inside the house, and he slowly walked back onto the front porch and stumbled down the stairs. Nate could see a pair of dark red eyes at the top of the stairs. Nate gasped as he heard loud breathing and the nettling creak of something descending the staircase. Needless to say, Nate was halfway down the road before he looked back and saw big red eyes looming in the doorway. Nate yelled and continued running down the hill away from the house until he reached the main well-lit street. Nate decided to lay low and nurse his 2-day-long hangover brought on by the amount of the expensive bourbon he consumed the night at the old Manor Hill house. He grappled with the idea of canceling this meeting after seeing something he couldn't quite make out at the old house. But upon seeing Grady and Odessa step out of their fancy car, dressed to the nines while he rummaged for food at the corner bakery, just made Nate more furious than ever, and he had to reciprocate their betrayal once and for all. Saturday night finally rolled around, and Nate showed up just as the lounge was closing and sat outside at the bus stop across the street, just in time to see Grady get in his BMW and take off towards the old Manor Hill house. The time was 2:30 a.m., and with just enough time for Nate to alert Rob to light the fireplace, set up some chairs near it, and get out of there. Rob did exactly as Nate instructed. Nate made it to the old Hill house and noticed Grady's BMW was parked outside. Nate snuck up to the house to see Grady sitting in one of the chairs. Resting in the fireplace was a frying pan with what looked like bacon cooking, which caused Nate to steam as he noticed Rob must have gotten hungry and was making himself something to eat when Grady showed up and he had to bolt. Rob called Grady to tell him he'd just stepped out to go buy a pack of cigarettes and that he'd be there around 3:10 a.m. Grady began to swear loudly, stating he had exactly 3:10 on the dot to get there, or all bets were off. Grady looked around and was spooked to the bone, noticing the large black stains on the floor near the fireplace. Nate looked on through the window, shivering, but anxious to see what was to take place at the witching hour. Suddenly, one by one, what looked like transparent beings ascended out of the shadows, looked directly at Grady, and said in a ghostly echo, "You better not be here when Tom comes." Nate's eyes stretched to capacity with his mouth wide open as he witnessed a huge 7-foot-tall horned demon with clawed feet and hands, and large horns protruding from his head began descending down the stairs. The demon, hastily and with a heavy gait, stomped towards a now petrified Grady, who mustered the strength to ask, while shaking and in disbelief, Who are you?" The beast growled, and in a grave, deep, and demonic voice growled, "I'm Tom." Its giant webbed clawed hand reached inside the blazing fire and swiped up the bacon from a smoking red-hot skillet and opened its mouth, exposing rows of giant, sharp, and crooked teeth. It then picked up the fiery red-hot iron pan with its long, sharp black nails, laid the skillet against its mouth, and drank the sizzling hot grease. An incredulous Grady looked on in terror. The bloodthirsty attack Nate then witnessed next caused him to lose consciousness and fall to the ground as everything around him went black. As the sun began to rise, Nate found himself on the ground, freezing. He sat up and quickly made his way back down the old dirt road and once again away from the old Manor Hill house. That night, an anxious Nate showed up at Grady's lounge to see police officers talking to staff about the whereabouts of the owner, Grady Benjamin. He was reported missing by Odessa Landry after not coming home the previous night. Police found his car parked on the side of the old Manor Hill house, but Grady was nowhere to be found. Later that week, Grady's bank contacted his longtime business partner and partial club owner to resume operations in the wake of Grady's absence. None other than Nate Banks.